Hello, everybody. It's time for another episode of DLN Xtend, episode number 21. We'll take a look at the recent events on the Destination Linux network, including shows, creators, and the community, and extend the discussion. I'm Nate, a Linux, fitness, and vintage tech enthusiast with an almost unhealthy obsession with the OpenSUSE project.
And I'm Eric. So, Nate, what have you been up to this week?
Well, it's been a busy week, getting a lot of springtime projects rolling. And a big part of that has been using Fusion 360 on OpenSUSE, designing a rollout pantry to make my kitchen more efficient.
Love it.
So it's pretty exciting, and I can even make it look pretty. I think I sent you some pictures that has the wood grain on it and everything. The design process on it's not exactly what I'm used to doing with my for my regular job, but it's close enough. Some things are a little bit reversed, but it's close enough to get what I need done.
Do you get the sense sometimes that just to be contrary, that they design software to just be different because? I don't know. I've found that so many times in competitive products. And actually, funny enough, certain programs like DaVinci Resolve comes to mind. When you start, it'll actually ask you, which keyboard shortcuts are you familiar with? And actually let you switch the templates.
What's funny, though, about using Fusion 360 compared to Creo, certain things are just exactly the opposite. Like the pan and zoom, literally pan, zoom, and rotate. They're all exactly the opposite of what it is on Creo. And so I'm constantly getting tripped up doing that. And I think I could change those controls so that I can unify my interface. But I decided I'm just going to use it like it is. So, if someone else asks me about using Fusion 360, I'll know how to do that. Which made me laugh, and I shouted and called myself a hypocrite because, when it comes to desktop interfaces, I don't want to change how I use a desktop to get my work done, but I'll do it for a CAD application. And I don't understand my problem. Yeah, like, why is it okay here, not okay here? I don't know. The duality of man, I think that's the real reason.
Something like that. So beyond the little sort of annoyances, you seem to have been able to come up with something pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I actually decided I'm taking this entire project from design to actually constructing it. I will be making a video out of that. When I'll actually publish it, I'm not sure, but I am going to make a video out of it. So I've recorded the design process, and I want to start to record the process of actually doing the drawing. And then that's when I found out that Fusion 360 doing drawings in Linux is rather broken. So, I've got a workaround. Yeah, I'm actually going to import it to FreeCAD and then do the 2D drawings there. Just to lay it out. And I would use FreeCAD for everything, but the issue is there's certain of the parametric constraints don't seem to hold up. So if I change a dimension of something early in the model tree, it will cause everything else to break further on. And Fusion 360 seems to be more tolerant to such things. And also Fusion 360 is closer to what I'm used to. And there's a lot of little things that it does. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not still trying to use FreeCAD, but just for me personally, it's just I'm not quite able to do what I want to do and as quickly. And I think we talked about this before, but it's so easy. Fusion 360 is so easy to use, the different features on it, that from not watching a single video on how to use it, just by the way the buttons are laid out and how the tools work and the little menus and such, I was able to design something, which would have probably taken me maybe half an hour to do in Creo, which is what I use every day. It took me about 45 minutes to do in Fusion 360, and that's learning everything, maybe an hour. But yeah, so that's how easy it was, and that actually took me many hours and not actually completing it in FreeCAD. Not to say, it's just how it didn't quite work with me, essentially, is the problem.
Yeah. Well, and I thought you were going to say like many hours in 45 minutes or maybe an hour. And a lot of that is just the adjustment. So I'm assuming that future projects, you would be probably a little more efficient, or at least know your way around. But that's great that it was intuitive enough that you were able to just get in there and start doing what you do. I think that's the the mark of a well-designed piece of software.
Yeah, I agree. Something that just intuitively makes sense. And actually, Creo does not intuitively make sense. Like if you jump into that one's pretty convoluted actually. But once you understand how it works and how to pull the switches and flip the triggers, it's very quick to use, and how they do things, it's a very quick process. But it crashes slowly. So if you start to crash in Creo, you don't know for a while. And then it's one of those to save early, save often. Anyway, but yeah, so I'm really excited. Tomorrow I finished the design process. I have to just kind of lay it out. I just want to do a drawing on it, just so, because it's, for me, when you're actually working with cutting the wood and everything else, it's nice to have the drawing right there to kind of guide me, rather than have a laptop sitting there getting sawdust on it. So suppose I could use a tablet, but I don't want to do that. Now that I think that, I could use a tablet because there's a Fusion 360 app that can tie in and everything too, but I'm just going to print it out.
But I assume unless you're making adjustments as you go, that's kind of overkill.
It is. It would be overkill.
I mean, sure, it would be cooler.
Kind of cool, yeah. Way cooler. Is that a piece of paper? So actually, I'm going to look into that now that I've just said that, because I'm going to see if that actually might be a better way to go. So we'll see how that goes. Could be a total fail, but at least I tried.
And then you'll know.
So Eric, what have you been up to?
Well, I actually took a bit of a break from desktop Linux over the last week or so, and looked into some of the pros and cons of virtual machines, virtual environments, containers. So I was looking at LXD in particular. It's just not something I've spent much time with. That's a pretty common, the idea of a virtual environment is a pretty common thing, particularly in like web hosting. Just not something I'd done personally on my own system. So I did a bunch of testing with that. And I've been using things like containers like Docker and things like that for a while. It's interesting because I think with anything you learn as much as you need to. So the practicality of the knowledge that you acquire, and like how deep do I have to go? It's just fun sometimes to go beyond what you already know. I took the example of just building a local web instance on something, and I usually use a virtual machine and just have multiple virtual machines for different things I do. Then I thought, well, let's see what the LXD or virtual environments, how that might work. The thing with a virtual machine is it's kind of a predetermined entity where you give it a certain amount of processor cores and memory, disk space.
Yeah, that's what I'm most familiar with are virtual machines. You're generally using like KVM, QEMU, whatever. So I understand that one. And I've only played around with Docker, and so I kind of understand that one. It seems like it's like a self-contained, but not a full environment, but just kind of a little bit of a slice of a computer, I guess. I really know how to define that, actually.
Virtual machines, I think everybody's pretty comfortable with that concept at this point. It's just literally a virtualized piece of hardware, for lack of a better way to say it, because you're determining the amount of resources that it gets, and then those resources are tied to that machine, and it doesn't necessarily scale. And I'm talking about like desktop grade stuff here. I mean, there's virtualization that is way more advanced. And the difference then with something like a virtual environment is like LXD, unless you set a limit, it can just use the resources of your system. So for example, if you spin up a virtual environment and you don't limit it, it sees all of the resources of your system. So, if I have 16 gigs of memory, theoretically it could use all 16 gigs of it if it needed to. It
sees what's available, so it wouldn't just gobble it up, or how does that work?
Well, your operating system is still going to control ultimately the hardware resources. So there's still a layer. It's abstracted up into the virtual environment, but it's kind of interesting. So my thought process was, instead of having to be rigid about a virtual machine and predetermining these things, that if it could be more dynamic and use less resources when it doesn't need them. And that's kind of the advantage of a virtual environment, is that you can have a lot of them running, because at any given time, they're not going to be using as much resources as, let's say, if you have, let's say 16 gigs of RAM or 8 gigs of RAM, and each virtual machine has 1 or 2 gigs of memory. Obviously, you can only run a few of them before you start running out of memory. A virtual environment will use as much memory as it needs, so you could theoretically have a dozen of them running. you're not setting and saying like when this thing starts, it just automatically gets allocated 2 gigs of RAM. It just starts, and whatever RAM it needs, it takes. And you can limit that so that it doesn't overstep and that you don't run out of resources. But, it's not using more than it needs at any given time. So therefore, in terms of like scalability, or let's say it works better than a virtual machine, which is why something like shared web hosting, where they might have a lot of different virtual environments on a piece of hardware, and then limit that to the amount of memory it can take.
So what is the delineation between a virtual environment and a container? Because to me, a virtual environment sounds like a container.
So the difference is a virtual environment is still a virtualized operating system. So it's still, it's still an instance of something, Ubuntu, Fedora, Red Hat, SUSE, whatever. It still has an underlying full system, if you will.
Okay.
Whereas something like Docker has a virtualization layer, and the layer itself, the Docker, the container engine manages all of that part of it. And the container itself can be literally just the thing. So if it's a web server, if it's a database server, if it's, whatever that thing is, that's just that container. So it's usually a single purpose container. Normally in practice, what you see is that it's one container per function or software.
Right. Okay.
Versus a virtual environment where it is virtualized in a different way, but it's still, I'm butchering this and I apologize for anyone who knows all the proper terminology. That's kind of the major difference. So Dockers are a little cleaner in that sense. Docker containers are a little cleaner, but they're also much more ethereal, meaning that the intent is that you spin it up, you pass it some parameters, you can attach storage, you can attach network, you can make it so that they can communicate with each other, but it's very much self-contained, and also, you can literally just destroy it, versus something like a virtual environment. You've got everything set up in one container, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. Those things are part of a larger whole versus Docker containers, which they themselves are just pieces, and you can pull and push those pieces in and out as needed, take it down, spin it back up. The beauty of that is there's very little overhead in doing that. So if you need a new Apache web server, you literally just spin up a container for it, pass it whatever parameters you need, and it's just there. Versus a virtual environment, you're probably limited to that one instance of that piece of software. Versus Docker, I can have 20 of the same thing running because they're completely contained, and then I can choose how I hook them together and how they interact. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of explaining this or not.
That makes sense. There's a couple of Docker things that I've gone so far as download them and then run them, and then that was it. There's 2 things that I want to play with Docker-wise. One is the home automation, the home assistant. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all.
Mm-hmm.
I have some equipment that I'm going to be pulling out of mothballs and re-implementing here fairly soon as well. And so there was a Docker image for that, rather than try and compile it or whatever, or run on a Raspberry Pi. I'd rather just run on a Docker image on my server. The other one being Jellyfin. So we've talked about Jellyfin before, and I still have failed to actually run it. So, and bad on me. That's another Docker image that I want to spin up. But the thing that I don't know is yet, they don't need to interact with anything other than, can I point them to like a folder on the host system?
Usually when you're getting an image, like when you download something like Nextcloud, it's pre-configured to operate properly. So your question about access to storage or stuff like that, like that's just baked into it because it would make no sense to run it and have it run one time. You do all the configuration, and then when you shut it off, it just forgets all of that.
Gotcha. Well, if I have questions when I start doing some things, I'm just going to, bother you.
Bother away. Anytime someone asks me a question, I usually end up learning something because I'll have this sense of confidence that, yeah, I know how to do that. And then if I need to explain something to someone else, all of a sudden it's like, oh, gives me an opportunity to improve.
Well, that's some neat stuff that you're doing. The virtual environments and the containers are a lot of my experience range, but I got the virtual machine piece, so it's neat. There's just so much to learn. It seems like, when I think I kind of got the virtual machine thing understood, then people are throwing these containers and virtual environments at me, like, whoa, what is this? What is this that you're talking about? These abstract concepts.
Well, and that's what I was alluding to with being sort of an old dog when it comes to this, because my mind is still fixed in that old machine-based world. If you have that foundational information, I think it helps, but ultimately it is a different skill set, different way to think about it. It felt good to dig into something and really dig deep and get a chance to focus on it. Time well spent. I certainly enjoyed doing it. Hopefully I can apply some of what I learned to my life and my business and make things better and easier.
And it's nice for me to have an expert in my back pocket of sorts.
So we got some listener feedback, which we absolutely love getting. I got an email from ThatComputerKid. He sent me a message about EndeavourOS when we were talking about it recently. And I had made the statement something to the effect of it was just an easy way to install Arch. And his message to me was, I would like to disagree with you guys saying that Endeavour is a good way to install Arch. EndeavourOS is not a way to install Arch. You might as well say that Ubuntu is a good way to install Debian. Arch Linux install is an experience, not a rite of passage or eliteness, though. While EndeavourOS is a great operating system powered by Arch, it isn't Arch. Again, consider the Ubuntu equals Debian analogy. Endeavour be Endeavour and Arch be Arch. So I was pretty intrigued by that. I thought, okay, what am I missing? Because I'm thinking of it as a very sort of from a technical perspective of Endeavour is very much based on Arch. When I think of something like Manjaro, they have their own repositories, their own release cadence. They make a lot of changes to packages. They're based on Arch, but they're very much their own thing. So my reply to him was essentially that, and I won't read it verbatim, but I essentially said that, where yes, EndeavourOS is not just installing Arch, but I looked at an install of Cinnamon on Endeavour just to check this, and there is an EndeavourOS repo that had been through GitHub, and now they have their own. As of the April release, they also have the option of a private repo, but I could only find 12 packages that it installs. And so you're talking a system of thousands of packages, and almost all of them, well over 95%, I would say, are coming from the Arch repos or the AUR. And so to me, outside of those 12 packages, yes, maybe there's a couple configuration files or, the mirror list. There's probably some things that obviously are being changed by EndeavourOS, but very, very little compared to the totality of the system. And that's basically what I communicated back and just said, like, I'm not trying to be defensive here. I think I'm missing your point. And he got back and said that really what he was talking about is the learning experience that you get from installing Arch, having to put the thought into your system and, what disks do I have? What's appropriate for my system? What type of bootloader do I need? All of the detail and minutia that you have to understand when you install Arch. And so that was really his point, was there's a benefit in doing that and understanding your system. And so learning about your hardware specifically, but then also the technical exercise of sort of learning some of the ins and outs of Linux itself, bootloaders and file systems, and sort of how all of these pieces fit together. And that's absolutely valid. And I get that. But again, I thought it was much more of like he was saying technically that Endeavour was not Arch, where he was saying the experience of installing Endeavour was not the experience of installing Arch, which I completely agree with. And, we went back and forth about 5 times, and it was a great discussion. I'm really glad that he wrote to me and we talked about this. And eventually my answer back to him was, I get all that, and I'm lazy. To me, Endeavour's great because I can just boot into a live environment, pick the desktop I want, partition my disks, and just get on with my life. And there's still a considerable amount of customization that has to happen after that. So unlike something like Manjaro, where they do a lot of the system configuration for you in terms of just, all the behind the scenes things that you normally have to do with Arch, Manjaro is doing a large percentage, if not most of that, versus, Endeavor does configure some things. They give you ways to set your mirror list and install drivers and some things like that. But ultimately, I find that Endeavor, I still have a lot of work to do to set everything up the way I want it to be. Like, I'm willing to do all of that. It's the install part that I don't have the patience, honestly. And I don't know if that's laziness or what.
So, looking at the emails, I was trying to understand, because my understanding of Arch is not the process by which you install a system, but Arch being the system that you're running. Because to me, I want to get the install done with as quickly as possible, then I can rep out any pieces that I want. So if I were to install Arch, I would go the Endeavor way, because I don't really want to have to go through the tedious process of setting it all up. I mean, I guess there is something to be said. Some people, they set up their Arch systems and actually have their own script that actually pulls everything down and does it for them. But then I would question, then that must not be Arch, because you have a script. So that script is, whatever you call yourself, I suppose. Not
based on
EndeavourOS.
His logic. Yeah, I mean, based on his logic, I would agree with that.
Right. So that wouldn't be Arch if you create your own script. That would be Cubicle NateOS if I built my own Arch script, which would be a terrible OS and probably inconsistent and, not want to show up for work sometimes. But anyway, I understand his point, but to me, Arch is the core system that's running. But then I guess in a way, maybe he's saying Arch is a very personal thing as opposed to a general thing. It says Arch could be is whatever you make of it. Arch is a personal expression of how you want to run a Linux system, I suppose.
He has a very valid point. If you don't understand the fundamentals of Linux, I think it's a great way. You're not going to learn everything, but you're going to learn a bunch about if you install something and it's a systemd service, Arch isn't going to enable it and start it for you. You need to know that I need to enable it and start it. You need to know how to do that. You don't need to know that if you run certain distributions, and that's fine. That's what they're there for. But if you have an interest and you're trying to actually learn sysadmin or just learn, how the system works, then that is a useful experience. Installation is really very much just setting the stage with something like Arch, where you've laid out, what we were just talking about virtual machines. I mean, you've just you've given it the resources, you've told it where to go, you've accounted for different pieces of hardware and how the environment needs to operate, if the video drivers, like there are absolutely parts of that are important to understand. But even with something like EndeavourOS doing that for you, after you get in there, to me, that's where all the opportunity lies in customizing your system. So all of the decisions that Ubuntu or Manjaro or any other, let's say, more packaged or predetermined distribution is going to do for you, Arch doesn't do that. And that's where it comes down to, if you want to print, you have to install cups. And if you want to, everything you want to do with the system, you have to proactively make that choice, versus other distributions where those choices have been made for you. And I would say that probably for most people, that's good, because they don't have to spend the time doing that. But certainly there are lots of people who appreciate the fact that nothing is there and nothing is predetermined or decided for them. And it's up to them to take the steps to make the system work the way they want it to.
This episode of DLN Xtend is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean offers the simplest, most developer-friendly cloud platform. It's optimized to make managing and scaling apps easy with an intuitive API, multiple storage options, integrated firewalls, load balancers, and so much more. You can get all that plus access to their world-class customer support for as low as $5 per month. DigitalOcean also has 2,000 cloud-agnostic tutorials to help you stay up to date with the latest open-source software, languages, and frameworks. Get started on DigitalOcean for 2 months free with a $100 credit by going to do.co/DLN. Again, you can get started on DigitalOcean with that $100 credit by going to do.co/DLN. And we thank DigitalOcean for sponsoring this episode of DLN Xtend.
And just as an aside, all of that part of discussing my week where I was looking at different servers, I did a lot of that on my local computer, but a lot of it, I really needed a public IP, a public server so that I could test things. And no lie, I probably spun up and destroyed 15 different instances.
Wow.
Yeah. And the beauty of DigitalOcean is that it's really easy. I go to my control panel, I say new instance, and in some cases, in most cases, it was just a plain server of something. It was either Ubuntu or CentOS. And in some cases, they have the images that are already there. So for certain things, it's pre-configured and you just spin it up and it's already pre-installed for you. It made it very easy for me. And I go back to that old dog mentality of having to do everything yourself and the amount of time it takes to set up a new server. The speed at which you can do it on DigitalOcean it makes life so easy to just test things. I would leave it run for a few hours and test what I needed to test and then just destroy it. And it may have cost me a few cents. It is a really amazing tool for learning how to do these things. Let's say you're just trying to learn how to set these things up and we talk about the tutorials. It's a great experience to go through, spin up the server, go and look at the first steps document, kind of run through that. And then, maybe the tutorial for setting up a web server or whatever it is you're setting up. Most likely there's a tutorial for it. You run through it. If you mess it up, I was installing a Jitsi server a couple weeks back just to play around with it and realized after I had set some things up that I kind of flubbed a few things. And rather than taking the time to fix it, which would have taken probably a half an hour, I realized, well, it only took me 10 minutes to spin it up and get it to this point. So I'll just destroy it and start again. That's really amazing to be able to do that. So that's just one of the ways that I use DigitalOcean. I used it quite a lot this week, and it was a great resource for me.
That's awesome.
In our DLN community focus for this week, there was a post that Ryan actually put in the jobs board. There's a jobs board section of the discourse forum. And he started off with the premise of, if you're interested in becoming a programmer, he had found a site that listed the most popular programming languages. So if you really didn't have an idea of what you were interested in, but just the idea of learning software development, what should be your focus in terms of the widest distribution, or let's say the most highly sought after skill set, language. And there was some discussion about that. There was an alternate site brought up. And then, the idea of, well, maybe some of this is a popularity contest. And are these really the most popular languages? That was all interesting discussion. But then it kind of led into, how do I actually go about this, right? Okay, here are maybe the list, whether or not we can claim that it's entirely accurate, but here's a list of popular languages. Great. Where do I go from there? And I actually chimed in and asked about my experience, which has been, I have a general interest in software development. I am proficient in a few languages in terms of being able to debug code and make very simple changes, but in terms of actually developing something, I am not a developer. I've never really had the application, and I think that's what it comes down to is I have the aptitude and I have the interest, but I don't have the outlet. And so I don't have a place to take this knowledge if I take the time to learn it. And I've been through so many different, tutorials and courses, and they're interesting as I do them. And then I get through, and inevitably at the end, you create some project, and I get through that. And I even riff on it a little bit and come up with my own ways of doing things and make sure I really understand it. But then I end up at the end of it not having a place to go with that knowledge. And then if I don't use it within, a month or two, that's it. It's gone. And if you don't put something into practice, then it's like learning 5 chords on the guitar and saying you know how to play the guitar. Like, you don't know how to play the guitar.
Yeah, you know 5 chords.
Yeah, exactly. And so my question came down to, okay, that's always been my problem. Like, how do I get past that? And is this the type of thing where instead of trying to learn this from the ground up and all the theory, should I find something like maybe an open source project that's written in a language that I'm interested in, and then actually get in there and try to solve a problem, or, you know, work on something that already exists, so that I'm looking at someone else's code and needing to, okay, I see this line here, I don't know what that means or what it does. Go and research and say, okay, how does this work? What is this doing? How does it fit into the larger whole? I really wanted to call attention to the fact that Eric Londo, who's behind Linux++, and we're going to talk about him in a few minutes, but he wrote back just an excellent response to that question, and did say that, yes, that is a really great way to do it, because if you jump into a project, you have a couple of things going for you at that point. One is, like I said, it's existing code, and you are looking at very specific things in that code and then trying to interpret and understand how it fits into the larger whole. And so you're not just starting with, you know, the beginnings of a program. You're actually needing to jump in and learn a larger context and more complex things right away, which I think would hold my interest a little more. And if I thought at the end of that I was actually able to contribute something, then I would probably find that more rewarding than just doing yet another task manager application or hello world or something like that. And so he said that is a good idea. The other benefit would be having people who know what they're doing review the code that you submit and be able to give you feedback and correct you, so that you're not just working in isolation and maybe forming bad habits. It's a fantastic response. It is a 1.5 pages long in true Eric Londo style. And I mean that in the best possible sense. He put a lot of thought into this. And I'm going to link to this in the show notes just so folks can see it. But if you're in the situation that I've been, where you have an interest and have maybe even gone through a couple of different tutorials, courses, whatever you want to call them, and came out the other side kind of not sure where to go, I think this is a great explanation of maybe how to get past that trap that I keep falling into. I
responded to that on the forum as well, because he made a statement about Python specifically that stuck out to me, and I think maybe I didn't fully understand maybe what he was saying, but he said that, you know, Python is pretty close to English and it can be used for basically anything these days, though in practice it probably shouldn't be. And that kind of made me like, oh, huh, because my employer, they do a lot of, as he put it, like pet projects, or they do design concepts using Python because it's quick and they can test something and then they can optimize the code later. So I guess that makes sense why he would say maybe in practice it shouldn't be. But it was a really good response though, because it's, you know, Python is an interpreted language as opposed to a, you know, more of a lower level, or, you know, more of a direct language like C, compiled language. So although I did read there are compilers for Python.
So I think because Python is so accessible, people have done things with it. And you're right. I think if you're prototyping, if you are testing a concept, if you are, you know, if you have team members that are proficient in Python, and then maybe it's a certain skill set of other developers to, you know, to work in those more, let's say, applied or complex, or, you know, however you want to say that. I'm not trying to belittle Python by any stretch of the imagination, but it's extensible. And I think that's what he's kind of talking about, is you can do so much with it, and right, maybe leads people into putting it into production in a way that it maybe isn't the best application of that. You know, you've gone beyond the prototyping and now you're, you know, like you said, maybe now it's time. Like this is something we're going to pursue in a long-term way, that maybe Python isn't the best language for that. But again, I don't know. I think this might help me get past that. I really appreciate him taking the time to, and not just him, there were a lot of people in there putting in great input. And that's what's great about the the discourse forum. I know at least once a show go off on a tangent about how great the Discourse Forum is, but there really are some pretty amazing people contributing in there who just amazing backgrounds and skill sets. And, you start talking about development, all of a sudden, all these people come out of the woodwork, and it's like to see the list of languages that some of these people know. And I guess it's the type of thing that once you understand the fundamental concepts that, you can adapt at least the thought process to a different language. But to see like some of these people know 15 different programming languages, and you think, man, that's what an amazing body of work or feat to have, gone that deep into software development where you can look at so many different things. Because most of the time I look at code and it's like, yep, that's some characters on a page. All right.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because like I was helping my that wasn't much help at all. My brother-in-law is working on stuff for in PowerShell, and I'm like, that's PowerShell. I've never even seen PowerShell, but I mean, you can kind of make out what's going on there, but I didn't know what any of those arrays were and what they meant, so I couldn't actually help him, but he thought I could.
And you just heard me mention Linux++. I'm not sure if we actually, I think I may have announced it when we talked about front page Linux, but Linux++, Eric Londo had started that on Medium. Michael and I had talked to him and said, we're working on a news site. Well, not just news, but a site focused on written content. And would you be interested in contributing there? Is there some reason that you're tied to Medium? I'm not trying to speak for him, but he basically said, well, it was the one that was most accessible to me, and it just fit my needs, and so that's what I did. So we've helped him transition over to Front Page Linux, and he's been publishing on there. It's fantastic content. There's so much to go through, and normally I do not go for long form written content because I've become lazy in some respects, where I like to look for a video. I do. I mean, there's something about video that there's that sort of, usually some sort of personality behind it, and you can kind of, for better, for worse, you kind of judge the person and have a sense of like their mastery of something. And not that you can't do that with the written word, but there's just something that's much more immediate about that. But anyway, when he started first publishing, I mean, I think from the first edition he put out, I had seen it on Twitter and was immediately interested. And it's great content. He's able to write and be concise, yet not have it be very dry. Like he introduces a personal opinion, but it's all wrapped in fact. A lot of the things he's covering are things that lots of people are covering, but the way he does it and the way he frames it and the way he's giving all of the background information, I really like that, because he doesn't just say, okay, there's a new release of Ubuntu and here's the 10 new things that are in there and here you go. Like, he actually gives a lot of frames it. He frames it and says, not everybody in the world knows what Ubuntu is, so maybe we should give a little bit of context here. And it feels very much more journalistic than it does fanboyistic, which I know that's
a good term.
It is, but I'm yeah. Or maybe the opposite, someone who doesn't like something and they're criticizing it. Journalism, in the sense that it's
you want to watch things burn.
Well, I guess impartial it might be the wrong word, but it is complete in the sense that he's offering different viewpoints. Anyway, I really enjoy it, as you can obviously tell. I could sit here and go on for way longer than I should. If you haven't checked out Linux++, you really should go take a look at it. It's good stuff.
In episode 8 of Hardware Addicts, Wendy, Ryan, and Michael, and I put them in that order for a reason. So what they brought up was the latest of AMD mobile processors. Now, these are low power yet powerful processors that are going into mobile devices, and they're talking about the power consumption is so much less than that of the Intel counterparts, and they kept talking, AMD versus Intel, and then it was also the talk of an AMD CPU with an NVIDIA GPU, and I wouldn't be interested in that at all. But what I thought was interesting and what didn't seem like the real story there, and I don't have any hard numbers. I couldn't find any hard numbers on actual power consumption for the amount of work done, but it's looking like AMD's new mobile processors are going to be competing against ARM as far as compute power per watt consumed. I wish they may have gone down that road, and maybe there's not enough data out there to really start discussing this, but everyone's talking about ARM in the server room or ARM devices everywhere. But if AMD is developing chips that are truly this low in power consumption, I think there might be this might have changed the landscape again for some of these low power devices. And I don't know what your thoughts are on ARM, but my criticism of ARM has been there's so many different ARM platforms you can't really target ARM. It's like, which ARM? Pine 64, Raspberry Pi, or is it Raspberry Pi 3 and below, or Raspberry Pi 4? There's all these different architectures in ARM, which I think hurts it quite a bit, and to me makes it frustrating can you buy into this board, or you're going to lose support? How long is that support going to be for a board? But with x86 architecture, you pretty much have a 10, 15 year lifespan really that it can be targeted. So to me, maybe some single board AMD computers coming out in the future that are higher power, like higher compute power, that might be something that might be accessible to a lot of people. For me, like I'd rather run an edge device on a low power AMD as opposed to an ARM, because then I know that I can get support for for the long term on it, for the life of the product, pretty much. I don't know if you'd heard that or if you have any thoughts on that, but that I thought was what was really exciting me there.
When you talk about it conceptually, yeah. I mean, so what is the advantage of running an ARM-based system? Why are they becoming more popular today than, let's say the more higher powered processor alternatives? And so if you look conceptually and you say, yes, power consumption, size, cost, there's a lot of things that factor into that. When you start pushing the TDPs and the power consumption and the heat output down to a certain level on traditional x86 processors, then like all of a sudden you think, well, what is the advantage of ARM over that? And maybe cost will still be a factor, although I saw that they just put out some sub $100, I guess a line or a variant of what they're producing, and they're going after that low cost segment. So all of a sudden, like you're saying, like, do you start seeing devices that without a thought would have been ARM based because of those factors? Now all of a sudden, do you say, well, where's the advantage of doing that? And I agree with you. If it comes down to making the compromise between lower compute power because of the cost or the power consumption or the size or whatever those factors are, and those factors no longer hold true because you have an alternative that has the higher compute power, that has all of the same specifications in terms of power usage and heat output and size and cost, I'm with you. Of course, I would want something that's more capable. I think one of the biggest challenges for ARM has been the software compatibility, right? Everything's built for x86, and that's been sort of the story of the Pinebook and other devices. Is it's getting better, and you're seeing a lot wider support, and things are being, when they're developed, they're compiled into ARM64. I agree with you in terms of the lack of a standard, because if I buy an AMD or an Intel processor, I know it's going to be compatible. Anything that has that instruction set is going to, if it says it's x86 based, then, it's going to varying degrees of efficacy, perhaps, but
nothing that I've purchased in the last 15, 16 years does have a compatibility issue. I think there were issues probably in the 90s when the architecture was kind of going through some more changes, but anymore, x86 is x86. There's a certain standard, but you don't have that with ARM. But ARM is actually about as old. The Acorn Archimedes, I think that was the original ARM processor computer that was released. Maybe not the first, but one of the early computers. So it's been around a long time, but just doesn't have that same kind of consistency. And to me, that's frustrating.
It is frustrating because I also agree. Like if I buy a Rock Pro or if I buy one of these systems, what is available? Like what can I actually do with it? Part of that too is the expectation, right? If I get a Raspberry Pi, I know that there are going to be limitations, but that's okay because the use case for that is probably going to be very limited in what I expect it to do. I would never buy a desktop PC or a laptop that I would expect to have just wide compatibility with software and have to deal with that sort of limit. And I know, again, people who are using the Pinebook and similar systems, there is an expectation, well, unless you don't know any better, and then I guess you would be pretty disappointed, but there's an expectation that it has limits and that most people are okay with those limits because they, again, are making the choice to have very lightweight, low cost, reasonable performance with exceptional battery life, but obviously trading off compatibility because of it. So you've got ARM increasing its compute capability and also software developers focusing more on that platform. And so it's kind of from the bottom up being built up. And then on the other side of it, you've got x86 processors now becoming more and more efficient, but they're not slowing down. These lower wattage, lower TDP, I mean, yes, of course, it's not going to be as powerful as a huge Ryzen or Threadripper system, but you know that. And the capabilities of each successive generation, even at these lower tier compute power, are still way more capable than any ARM-based system in terms of compatibility and compute power.
Right.
You've got the established processor architecture coming down to meet the use case that ARM was at, and you've got ARM coming up to try to meet the use case where existing architecture already lives. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if, because I think one of the examples of maybe ARM gone wrong, maybe this is not fair to say, but the Raspberry Pi 4, which when it was released, got really hot, and sure, it could output 4K video or whatever, but not very well. The real issue is how hot it got, and that's not going to work either. But if you're still not getting the performance of even a lower end Celeron mobile processor, really, yeah, I don't know. Like to me, I don't see, in some ways, I don't see the benefit in ARM trying to get to desktop levels. It seems like they should just stay where they work best, in a mobile phone type application or
the very specific kit-based systems, right? The advantage of a Raspberry Pi is it has the header on it that you can attach to all sorts of different hardware devices, and you use it they're single-purpose systems in a lot of ways, right? I have a Pi Series 2 that's running Pi-hole, and I wouldn't dream of putting 10 different processes, different services on that system. Why? They cost $30.
Right.
If I needed another one, I would just go get another one. I agree with you to some extent that there is this interest and push for these processors to be more than that. And I don't have a problem with that. Like I think the idea of a Pinebook and compatibility and seeing things like Manjaro having a release for that, and it has its place, but I feel like it's very limited. And if price and performance get to a point on traditional processor architectures, and like you said, if there's a choice between the ARM system or a much more capable processor architecture, then I'd have to have a very specific use case to choose ARM in that instance.
Well, I look at it this way. If I were buying, let's say, a single board computer that I have a purpose in mind for, like let's say like an edge device or whatever, I would actually spend twice as much without feeling bad about it for an x86 architecture for similar or better computational capabilities just because it's x86, and I know my flexibility be so much greater.
But especially if you're saying, okay, you would pay twice as much, and if we're saying a $30 or $40 single board computer versus a, I don't know, sub $100 x86 system of comparable size, and yeah, if I could run 5 processes off of a single $80 system, Anyway, maybe it's not fair. If you had a project that just needed a single board computer that had the headers on it to hook up some type of hardware, and this was the project you were undertaking, and it was the right fit for that, then yeah, I mean, why would you spend more on something that would be more capable, but you don't need that capability? So I guess the use cases might be different, and this is maybe just us projecting our kind of our idea of
old
what's...
man.
No, it's not even necessarily old man.
It's
it's more of a value proposition. If you just want to have an extra system sitting around with wide capability to do all sorts of different things, then maybe a single board computer isn't the best choice in that case, not knowing like exactly what you might want to use it for. I'm using that Pi now, but it literally sat in my closet for 2 years, and I didn't have a use for it because it was only good for those types of things, and I just didn't have any projects. Mm-hmm. If it were, an Intel NUC or some, x86 based system, like I probably would have figured out something to do with it because I could have done a lot of things with it.
I think the compelling story for me when it comes to ARM mostly is Pine right now, because they do have those multiple offerings, different form factors, but they're all, compatible with one another, the phone, the book, and the tablet. So that I think changes the story, changes the narrative quite a bit. I did order a Pine phone, so I am looking forward to that. After I just trashed on ARM, I just bought a Pine phone, and I'm really excited about it. So we'll see how that goes. Also, on Hardware Addicts, Ryan brought up he got a USB audio device and how it worked on multiple different operating systems without any kind of fussing around with it. And it interestingly or not, I've also been looking at some sort of an USB audio device as well, a little bit different than what he's been looking at, what he bought. And because I'm doing a little more with podcasts and I'm dabbling in the YouTube sphere and so forth, and I have some other things noodling around in my head. I've been looking at different audio devices as well. And to me, what would be really compelling is one of these small, 6-channel soundboards. I'm looking at one here on the webs right now, but it can output its sound as a digital audio device into your computer. So you could have all those different things that you need to be real time in a separate device outside of the computer. Because we've talked about like pulse audio troubles and setting up jack and the joys of that. And now there's Pipewire or something like that coming out here soon. So who knows what kind of problems that's going to bring. Or maybe it'll solve all the problems and this is a waste of time. But the idea of having an external device, that's USB, that could handle all the mixing and whatever that you need, and then have the computer just be the recorder, that to me there's a compelling device as well. And have you looked at anything like that?
The short answer to your question is sometimes that can be the easiest way to isolate concerns and just be able to focus on, here's this device I'm going to plug in the USB. The great thing about a lot of this, and you have to be careful, you definitely want to read and figure out if it's compatible, but most things that I've seen or that I've tried, even ones that didn't claim to have Linux compatibility, the chipsets are, I guess, generic or universal enough that they just worked. And these are even with not like the latest kernels. This is just, I guess, long-standing technology. So yeah, I think if you're having audio issues with your onboard audio, that a USB audio device could be a great way to get around that. Ironically, simplify the issue instead of potentially, like, you could imagine it being more complicated. Because when I look at the devices through the settings panel, now of course I've got the onboard audio, I've got my USB mixer, which looks like a sound card because it has inputs and outputs, and I have this USB device. So I've got probably 6 of each inputs and outputs. So, but at the end of the day, it's just easier to have that one device and work with it.
Yeah, I think to me what seems compelling to me is one knob to adjust for compressor, and then you can actually see the output and effects, immediately. I don't know. I see little things like that, like, that seems like a really handy way to do things, but could be more trouble than it's worth, I suppose. We'd like to continue this discussion with you in any of our forums that we have: Telegram, Discourse, Mumble, Discord, or yeah, you can dial up my digits, I suppose.
Carrier pigeon, yeah.
Smoke signals. Visit the DLN website for information on how to connect to the social channels and also on shows and creators at destinationlinux.network. For more information on where to find us, for me, you can go to the creator section of destinationlinux.network and click away, or you can go to cubiclenate.com. Links to my regular things are there. What about you, Eric?
Well, the easiest thing for me, I think, is to just go to destinationlinux.network. Under the creator section, you'll find me there. Got links to all of my different social media, as well as YouTube and Front Page Linux and all of that good stuff. Rather than me reading all that out, just go check that out. I'd love to hear from you, so drop me a line. And as always, would like to thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoy listening half as much as we enjoyed making this podcast. And we'll be back with another episode of DLN Xtend. Until then,
see yous.